Hi everyone, this is Counseling 4000, Chapter 16, Social Histories and Assessment Forms. A complete example is found in your textbook on page 307 to 309. Assessments forms, typically specific to a particular high-risk population, and then some agencies have more of a generic form. So depending on where you work, it might be specific to, let's say, alcoholism or whatever, or it could be a lot more generic and more generalized. Note the form you are working with is a generic one and may not be exactly like the one you see at your current or future agency. What we want you to do with this class is to have these forms completed at least once so that you have an understanding of how to fill out these forms and kind of what to expect when it comes to the actual forms itself, what kind of questions and stuff like that. All right, forms depend on also the population, so it could be children and their families, women's issues, substance abuse, mental health, intellectual disabilities, or in aging. So again, it depends on the population that you're working with. So what is a social history? What it is a description and history of the presenting problem, the problem that brought the client to the agency, background information about the person's life, including background related to the presenting problem, and the worker's impression and recommendation. So that means you as the worker or the social worker, case manager, and stuff like that, is that you're also going to write down what your impressions of with the client and also what your recommendations are to help this person. Acts as a baseline for decisions about services and to measure client progress. The assessment is written at the end of the social history, impressions, and recommendations, and is a collaborative effort between you and the client. Again, a lot of this stuff is about you getting information from them, and because you're an educated, experienced person, you two will work together to try to resolve and reach a way to work on the problems that they have brought into the agency uh, while they were seeking help. How to ask what you need to know. Clients who are giving a social history are usually people who do not know the agency or you. Talking openly about each of these aspects of their lives may be difficult. Again, you need to build rapport before you're able to really ask a lot of those difficult questions and get an honest answer. Begin by explaining that you will be taking a social history so that you and the client can determine what the issues are and the best plan for addressing these. Use plenty of open-ended questions when possible. Remember, open-ended questions are questions that require kind of a lengthier explanation. So tell me a little bit about why you are coming here, okay? A closed-ended question would be something like, what is your name? And you can just say Joe. So that means it's already a closed-ended question. It doesn't require any much more than that. Yeah. Here's an example. Closed-ended question is how many brothers and sisters do you have? Obviously, something like that would be 4 and 2 or 0 and 0. So they're very short answers. An open-ended question would be tell me a little bit about them. Okay, so you can have a closed-ended question first and then follow it up with an open-ended question. Here's a closed-ended question. Were you ever in the military? Obviously, the answer would be either yes or no. A closed-ended question would be, what time frame were you actively serving? So that could be 1997 to 2000, right? But an open-ended question would be, can you describe your military service? And then they can go on about exactly what they were doing while they were in the military service. It softens the interview, less prying, so clients can choose significant details to reveal about themselves without feeling grilled. What that means is a lot of times closed-ended questions sounds like an interrogation, like uh, there's no conversation. What happens is if you keep on asking closed-ended questions, the client feels like they shouldn't talk because they're waiting for you to ask questions, and then you're just going to answer that. They're going to just answer them, and that's it. With an open-ended, it's much more conversational, which is something a little bit harder for people to do when they're beginning working in the field of rehab or probation or whatever it is. So I encourage you to start practicing learning how to ask open-ended questions. So it's not all like, what's your name? Where do you live? Are you married? What's your gender? What's your birthday? What's your social security number? Things like that tend to be a little bit more harder for people to open up to another person. Description and history of the presenting problem. A brief summary of the presenting problem to be documented, no more than 2 to 3 paragraphs, and usually it's about 1 paragraph. Write the first sentence. The first sentence of the presenting problem is the first sentence as well as your impressions and recommendation. So here are some examples of what you can do. Tell me a little bit about what brought you here today. Or tell me a little bit about what happened. Or can you describe this problem a little for me? And then the last one is, could you give me some details on what's been going on lately? So as you can see, you are asking about a specific problem, but you're asking them to really open up and talk about it. Okay? So here are some examples of how that first statement can be written. Gustavo is a 42-year-old unemployed male, divorced father of 2 teenage girls, and currently referred for issues regarding use of alcohol and job-related difficulties. Another example would be Monique is a 69-year-old widow and British citizen visiting her oldest daughter in the United States, who was brought in by her daughter because of acute memory loss and confusion. The third one is Benjamin is a 36-year-old man, recently returned to college for an advanced degree in chemistry, who is suffering from depression he states began when his wife left him with the couple's 3-year-old son and the family dog. And the last one is Crystal is a 60-year-old high school sophomore who weighs 47 pounds, referred by her family physician and brought in by her parents concerned about her eating habits. So you can see it's a lot of info, very clearly written, very short and to the point, and that's really good because when someone skims over the paperwork, a professional, your supervisor, they want to know if you really are able to handle getting the gist of what the problem is, understanding what the major big picture is. Presenting problem. Gabby is a 47-year-old married woman with 1 daughter away in college who called requesting help for a depression she states has lasted almost 2 years, starting with the death of her mother. Gabby describes the depression as beginning after a serious episode with the flu and the death of her mother approximately 2 years ago. At the time her mother was ill, Gabby did not follow doctor's recommendations that she take off work and stay home. She was very involved in caring for her mother, who subsequently died. Gabby states she was not aware of being depressed until after the funeral, but grew depressed during the 8th-month period in which she and her husband cleaned out her mother's house and settled her mother's affairs. She describes this work as heart-wrenching and involved several legal difficulties. Currently, Gabby describes her depression as characterized by hypersomnia, an inability to go to work several days a month, and a loss of interest in social activities and friends. She states she is here in part because her husband insisted she get help. Okay, so you see how all of that is really good information, and it's all done within 1 paragraph. And then it's a really long, thick paragraph. However, it's enough that we really get the overall gist of what's going on with Gabby. Here's another example. Brian, a 38-year-old unmarried male Mexican citizen, contacted the agency at the suggestion of his boss, Ronaldo Rodriguez, who felt Brian was having emotional difficulties adjusting to living in the United States. Brian states he came to the United States from Mexico because his only family is living here. His brother and parents came to this country in 1982. His brother received a good education and went on to medical school, and currently practices medicine in Maryland. Brian was left behind with an aunt when the family immigrated because I was so hard to handle. Last year, the aunt died and Carlos came to the United States to join his family, who are all I have. Brian has been here for 8 months and is not sure if he wants to stay or return to Mexico. He describes feeling out of place in this American culture, particularly compared to his brother and his brother's lifestyle. He states he has no commitment to Mexico, but believes he would be more comfortable in familiar surroundings. In addition, he states his parents are putting pressure on me to remain in the country and get a better job. He describes them as critical of the few friends he has made and his lax attendance at church. So again, a really thorough understanding of who he is. One of the things I want to point out in this one is that there's a bunch of places where there's quotations, and those are because they're direct quotes or partial quotes from what Brian had said during this interview, okay, this beginning interview. Whenever you hear any vital important things about his emotions or his perception, it's great to use the client's actual words because it makes it more real and more authentic than going, the client reported this, but it's written in your own language, okay? So instead, if you can use little quotes of it, like such as feeling of being out of place, and that out of place is his words, that's really good because, you could interpret it as being lonely, but you're actually using his words, and that just makes it more authentic and truthful to what he is saying. Client's appraisal. Always ask the client what it is that they're seeking. They may not know what services are available, and they may understand part of what is possible. So again, sometimes clients come in without really knowing what they're getting themselves into. And sometimes they also don't know what kind of services exist in the real world. So this is really helpful for you if you communicate these things with them. So here are some common ways to ask questions to facilitate this. Tell me a little bit about what you see as the main problem. Could you tell me something about what you think is most important here? Could you give me some thoughts on how you see the problem? And do you have any thoughts about the services you would like to have from us? And the last one is, give me some ideas for what you have for how you feel we could help best or best help. So again, these are questions that really let you know and understand how much the client knows about the services that are being provided. Family origin. Relevant information about the family of origin, the family into which the person was born, information on the parents, their occupation, siblings, outstanding characteristics. So you can use questions like, can you tell me something about your brother? Could you describe your parents for me? Tell me a little bit about what your family was like. And can you describe what your home was like? And so these open-ended questions allow you to allow the client to open up and talk about these things. And you're going to be taking notes because you want to be able to summarize all of this in your document. Birth and childhood. To know whether pregnancy and birth of the person was complicated. So you might want to ask about important features of the child's childhood and what is remembered. And you want to get comments from the person that gives a flavor of the client's perception during this period of life. So here are some examples, which are, was it a happy or fraught with conflict? Which we're talking about is childhood, right, or birth. Fraught basically means like full of, okay? So was it happy or full of conflict? Did the child feel appreciated or ignored? And then, was the person asked to be very adult or allowed to be a child when they were children? You can also use, can you tell me something about your childhood? Tell me a little bit about what was growing up like. And describe a little bit more about your happy childhood. Do not write just this. The client reported an unhappy childhood, or the client says that childhood was a happy one. That's it. We don't really know much more. You need supportive details. Why was a childhood happy, or why is it an unhappy happy childhood? These things you will need to write down because it shows that you're listening and you're asking the right questions. Marriages and significant relationships. Include here all significant relationships, whether the couple actually went through a marriage ceremony or not, and if the client lived for several months or a year with someone, note this. A sentence or two per relationship, when it took place, how long that lasted, and why the relationship ended. Information about current relationship or an ex-spouse is important. Always mention children, ages, whether they reside with the parents, and where they are now. If the child is no longer living at home, document the degree of contact the parents and the children have. So you can use these types of phrases to learn more about all the stuff that we just talked about, which is, tell me a little bit more about him, her, or them, the children, or the partners. Can you describe something about what marriage was like for you? And tell me about your children. So again, that allows the client to really open up and talk about the relationship that they have with their kids or their partners. Current living arrangement, brief description of the home, how the client feels about the home, who lives there, and does the client feel the home is comfortable and adequate. So you can use something like, tell me a little bit about your home, or can you describe your life when you were at home? So you can see how that will then let you understand what it feels like when you are current living arrangements that you have right now. Education. Document the person's highest level of education. Note any difficulties or successes that were experienced in school. You can use questions like, can you tell me more about school? Can you explain a little bit about your problems in school? Or tell me a little bit about college. And then that can, of course, allow the client to open up and talk about that. Military service. Mention the type of discharge from the military and the status as a veteran. State no military service if it's not applicable. So you can use questions like, can you tell me about your military service? Or could you describe a few things that you did in the service? Never ever ask the person, hey, did you kill anyone? That's a very sensitive topic unless they're there specifically to talk about these memories. That potentially could become a trigger for something. And also it's a very personal question. And at this stage, if you're just beginning to get to know the client, it's not a really good question to ask at that moment. Employment history. Document the types of employment the individual has held. Note breaks in employment and give the reasons for the period of unemployment. Indicate how the person views the work she has done. And if the client has never worked, state no employment history. You can ask questions such as, tell me a little bit about working there. Can you give me some examples of the work that you did? And talk a little more about the work that you did. Medical history. Medical history is extremely important to medical personnel. A psychiatrist or a nurse may spot a possible underlying medical problem based on the information in this section. Ask about childhood illnesses and other illnesses, allergies, and surgeries. So questions that you can use are, tell me a little bit about your health. Could you describe the surgery a bit more for me? Can you tell me a little bit about the polio? Or describe those allergies. Behavioral health, mental health problems and substance abuse problems. Use this section if these were not the presenting problems, but you're seeking to know if these problems were present in the client's background at some point. So here are some questions that you can ask to find out more about this, which is, could you tell me about any issues you've had with drugs or alcohol? Can you describe any mental health problems that you might have had in the past? Tell me a little bit about any previous treatment you might have had for mental health issues, or describe any problems you might have had with drugs or alcohol. Again, open-ended questions that will really allow the client to open up and talk about these things. Although they might be brief because they don't necessarily trust you, it's a good starting point, and hopefully by now also because of who you are as a person, you're able to build a good relationship enough that they're trusting of you. Legal history. In many cases, there will be no legal history, so write no legal history. Involvement in a lawsuit or criminal case as either the defendant or plaintiff is usually stressful. Petty criminal activity gives insight into how people view authority and their place in society. Previous criminal activity may show how much a person has been able to turn her life around or unfortunate pattern. Okay, so again, through this section, you might actually see different types of behaviors that can come out during this time of counseling. You can use things such as, can you explain a little bit about the lawsuit? Or can you tell me about those early encounters with the law? Or could you tell me a little bit about what brought you into contact with law enforcement? Social and recreational interests. What interests them and what social and recreational activities they participate? If the client has no activities to report, note the section as has no social or recreational interest to report. It's important clues to the client's social involvement or withdrawal of. Has the absence been long-term or recently? So did they stop doing these things, these fun things that they normally like to do recently, or has it been a long time since they've actually done any of it? It could be a sign of depression. So here are some questions that you can ask, which is, tell me a little bit about what you do in your spare time. Fill me in on what you do for fun. And can you tell me a little bit about what you like to do most? Religious activities. Some are very involved in the church, synagogue, or mosque. Others hold firm spiritual beliefs. Others have neither religious involvement nor any interest in spiritual matters. Ask about their religious affiliation and activity. Explore with people who are spiritual what gives them strength and comfort. If your client is reluctant to discuss their beliefs, you can move along. You can come back later on. Okay. Here are some questions that you can use, which is, could you tell me a little bit more about your synagogue? Or tell me something about some of the beliefs that you feel are most helpful. Client successes, strengths, and resources. This section is not on all forms. Asking people what they are most proud of or what things they consider accomplishments make it clear that you expect a client to be, while a person, not a collection of problems. Note that the strengths and resources that the client brings, personal skills, financial assets, education, and social supports are really important. So you can ask questions such as, tell me a little bit about the things that make you proud. Can you tell a little about the things that you consider successful for you? So again, although this section is not necessarily on all forms, this is something that you can still ask so you can get to know that person a little bit. And then it might actually be a motivator for them to accomplish the problem that they are trying to resolve right now. Impressions and recommendations. Your own impressions and recommendations are written in this section. It's also known as a mental status exam, or MSE. First sentence of your presenting problem, and then go on to give a brief 1 to 2 sentence summary of what you have already written. Include the way the client appeared during the interview and any problems you see with memory or reality, anxiety, or depression. Then recommendations for services that might be considered when creating a treatment plan. Note that the client said about these recommendations. Okay, so again, you're going to let them know and they're going to let you know how they feel about it. How to write impressions and recommendations. There are 3 parts to this. The first one is a summary of the presenting problem. Begin with the first sentence of the presenting problem. Your second part is your impression, and then the third part is your recommendation. Writing the first sentence. Begin with the same sentence you used to open up your social history. So it could be examples such as, Victory is a 42-year-old married woman, the mother of 2 girls ages 12 and 12, so I'm assuming they're twins, which is complaining of depression and lack of energy. So then the next 2 or 3 sentences would be, she states that her depression began 4 months ago and has persisted during a time of marital strain. Husband is threatening divorce and appears to be seeing another woman. Okay, again, this is all the information you're getting from the previous questions that we're doing, and now you're kind of basically writing the summary. Next, state your impressions. Give your impressions of the client in the following areas. Functioning. Is the person able to function at work, school, and home? Affect. How does the person seem? Are they saying one thing but looking like a different way? Like, such as, are they talking about the death of a partner, but then they're laughing at the same time, because that affect would be not necessarily consistent, right? Vegetative functions. So we're talking about appetite, their sleep, and then their elimination. How are they doing with all those things? Are they not necessarily doing all those bodily things that they normally should be doing? Insight. Does the person appear to understand the problem, the origin of the problem, his or her contribution to the problem? So do they understand, do they have a realistic understanding of what's going on with their lives? And then, of course, motivation is, do they have that change or that help desire so that they want to actually do those things? Here's an example of a full thing here, which is Vanessa reports that she has trouble waking up, is unable to work at home or at her job effectively, and has neglected parenting responsibilities. She appears to have impaired occupational and social functioning accompanied by insomnia. Her affect is blunted, and at times she was tearful. She has good insight about her current marital situation and the role it may play in her depression. In addition, she expresses a desire to obtain help and to change some of the things in my life. And that last part is in quotations because that's a direct quote from her to show that she's actually motivated to actually change. And then you're going to end with recommendations. Do not use the word I. So example here would be, Vanessa is requesting a therapist with possible marital therapy in the future. Recommend psychiatric and medical evaluation of her depression and referral for 6 sessions of individual counseling, initially to address depression and marital issues. State the number of sessions, the number of days or hospitalization, the number of group therapy sessions, and then the reason for this recommendation. So example would be 6 therapy sessions with Dr. Francis Yu to address her anger management. There's also examples of this in the textbook on page 313 and 314. Here are some common errors when writing a social history. Number 1, people don't admit things. So there should be a very specific way of how you write, how they say or report stuff. Number 2, don't state things as fact if they are things you don't know personally or have not observed personally. Instead, use according to. Here's an example. If it's, let's say, the person's talking about drinking, you should not say, the client drinks 2 beers a day. Instead, you should say, according to the client, he reports that he drinks 2 beers a day. That way, you know that it's not necessarily a fact because you did not observe it. This is what that person is saying, because it could be lying. But part of that could be maybe that they don't trust you yet, and so they're going to say 2, and when in reality they drink like 8 bottles of beer or whatever. Okay. 3, don't recommend something without saying what it is for. So the first section right here, it says don't use. So this is not how you would write it. You wouldn't just say recommend psychiatric evaluation, because that doesn't really tell you what it's for. What kind of psychiatric evaluation, and why is it, why do you think that you need it? Number 2 is recommend 12 counseling sessions at Susquehanna Counseling. For what? We don't know why they're going to counseling. So instead, you want to write recommend psychiatric evaluation for depression, so that we know that there's going to be some sort of depression inventory or questionnaire survey that you're going to be using. And then recommend 12 counseling sessions at Susquehanna Counseling to address job loss, and then also depression. Okay, so that way we really know why they're going to therapy for 12 weeks or whatever, or 12 counseling sessions. Also, 4, don't leave gap in years. That just basically means don't have any missing information in there, because the person who's going to review it needs to know, right? And we don't need to go back to the client and ask them. The client should have told you, and if they didn't tell you, you should have asked to clarify, so the information is here already. For example, she lives with 4 other people, but don't have a clue who they are. So these 4 people, are they her siblings, her children, her friends, strangers that she met? What is it? We would like to know. Number 2, when it comes to not leaving gaps of information, would be they were married for 10 years and divorced for 3 years and have a 20-year-old son. We have no idea what that means. Is it like, what is going on here? You need to be a little bit more specific. And then, of course, maybe with years and stuff like that. And then 3, ask, what is the explanation for that? And you can ask them, and then they can explain that to you. So here are some examples. Some of them are okay responses, something that you might write now because you're not as experienced, but here's also a recommendation of how you can make it better. So here's an okay version. Janice's health is good. She states she has 1 surgery in 2007, but since then, she has been fine. So now we're going to combine it, but then also be a little bit more specific and clear. So the better version would be Janice's health is currently good. She had an appendectomy in 2008, but since that time, she has been fine. Okay. Here's another okay one, which is Veronica is the mother of 2 children. Right? That sounds like something you probably would write. Here's a better way of writing it. Veronica is the mother of 2 teenage children. Oliver, age 12, lives at home, and Michael, age 17, is currently in boot camp in Mount Allen. She states that she and Oliver get along well and that he is doing well in school. She sees Michael every other weekend and is hopeful that the boot camp experience will help him in the long run. So you can see how much more information. It's so good, it's because when a person reads it, like, okay, we know exactly what kind of relationship she has with her children. Here's some more okay and then better responses. Giovanni is currently active socially. For that, we really don't know what he's doing. What is he doing socially that's so great? Here's a better way to write that, which is Giovanni states he has a number of friends and sings in his church choir. Last summer, he joined a local baseball team and intends to continue this summer as well. He likes sports and goes to games with friends. Okay, now we know that he likes to go to church. That talks about his religiosity, but then he also likes baseball as well, and also he has a support system with friends. Okay, here's another okay version. Roy describes his childhood home as happy, but today does not know where 2 of his siblings are. That's kind of mysterious, right? So let's see how a better version of this would have been if you were to ask the right questions and then pay attention and then follow up with additional open-ended questions if necessary. Roy described his childhood as happy. He talks about a close relationship with his parents before their death and a number of activities such as scouting and wrestling, and that he participated in with his family's support. Roy has two sisters whose whereabouts are unknown. He states that at the time of his parents' death, they were already married and living in other states. He went to live with the family of a friend to finish high school and then went into the army. During that time, they lost touch with each other. So it really does explain exactly why Roy does not necessarily have the sibling supports that he needs or he has. Okay.